From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Westin. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. On the brief today, Anna Edgerton from Washington on what comes next in impeachment. From Los Angeles, Kevin Cirilli for a preview of tonight's Democratic presidential debate. And Therese Raphael from London on Prime Minister Johnson's Brexit plan. So, Anna, let's start with you first. What comes next on impeachment? Because I thought I knew, but I'm not sure I do now.
That's a pretty common sentiment in Washington right now. So the next step will be for the House to send the impeachment articles over to the Senate, for the Senate to start the trial of whether or not to remove Trump from office. Now, there's been a little bit of confusion between about 9 p.m. last night and right now to see whether or not the House would delay those articles in order to have some kind of leverage on what the Senate trial looks like. We just heard from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and she tried to kind of clarify that by saying it's more of a procedural question. They're not trying to seek any kind of political influence on the process in the Senate.
So why did you bring it up at all? Because I guess off script last night, she said, you know what, we don't have to send over the articles right away. And there is this pressure they're trying to bring to bear on Mitch McConnell and the Republicans to have more than just a pro forma trial.
That's right. And this is an idea that has been floated by people outside of Congress, people not on Capitol Hill, saying that this is how Democrats could insist on getting witnesses like John Bolton, like Mick Mulvaney, like Mike Pompeo from the Trump administration. But it's kind of become a bit more of, I think, a political confusion than Pelosi intended for it to be. She was asked about this in a press conference last night, right after the impeachment vote. And she kind of had this unscripted moment where she said she wasn't happy with the Senate trial, but even her top deputies were kind of surprised by that and kind of admitted behind the scenes that wasn't really their first plan A.
Okay, thank you so much to Anna Edgerton reporting from Washington. Now we're going to Los Angeles, where our chief Washington correspondent actually is in Los Angeles because there's a big debate tonight. What are we expecting, Kevin?
A massive debate. 7 Democratic presidential candidates going to be on that stage at Loyola Marymount University. The top-tier candidates, the dynamics, David, haven't significantly changed. Former Vice President Joe Biden still leading polls nationally, but dipping in polls in Iowa and New Hampshire. He will try to draw a contrast between Senator Bernie Sanders, who maintains a solidified base of support that hasn't gone up or down throughout this primary season. Meanwhile, Senator Elizabeth Warren, the Democrat from Massachusetts, has seen her poll numbers significantly take a hit, even as she's tried to sharpen the political knives, so to speak, and draw a sharper contrast with South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Look for Senator Warren to not only draw contrast tonight, I'm told, with Pete Buttigieg, but also with Senator Bernie Sanders. Some other candidates on that stage that are poised to have a breakout moment. Senator Amy Klobuchar, remember, she, along with Senator Sanders and Warren, will be participating in that Senate impeachment trial. She had a breakout moment during the Kavanaugh hearing, and she's been the buzz of the wonk world over the past week or so, as voters in Iowa reportedly have given her a second look. Andrew Yang is still in there, solidifying his base, solidifying his fundraising numbers, as is Tom Steyer. Someone who will not be on the stage, but who will be running a television ad, is Senator Cory Booker, the Democrat from New Jersey, who is still very much trying to get back on that debate stage.
Kevin Cirilli, thank you so much. We'll be listening to your coverage out there in Los Angeles of that Democratic debate. And now that's going to be on Bloomberg Radio coming up this evening. And now we want to turn over to London. Therese Raphael is over in London. And we had Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, come out and talk about Brexit. And I want us to really focus on 2 dates. One is January 31, 2020, and the other is December 31. What do we know?
Well, we had the Queen's speech today in which the government lays out its legislative agenda, and quite quickly after that, Boris Johnson began the process of getting his deal through Parliament, which should happen in quite short order. So the January 31st deadline looks very secure. After that, though, it's a little dicier. Johnson wants to get a trade deal with the EU done by the end of 2020. He could have asked for another year or 2 years to negotiate. He's choosing not to. He wants to get Brexit out of the headlines. He wants people to see it as done. That comes at a cost, though, because it means that he's not going to get to discuss and negotiate all the issues that Britain would like to get on the table in those talks. They'll have to accept a bare bones deal, and it gives the EU an upper hand in the negotiations.
So, Therese, as you suggest, there is a long list of items to be addressed in terms of the relationship between the United Kingdom and Europe going forward. There are a lot of trade agreements there to enter into. Do they really have the people to get that done in 11 months? Are they negotiating them now?
Well, they have been hiring people in trade negotiations and in the civil service for quite a while. So they've been sort of gearing up toward that. That said, I mean, there's a huge asymmetry between where the UK is in terms of negotiating a major trade deal in the European Union, which is, one of the biggest trade blocs in the world. The EU will be looking to sequence the talks in a way that advantages its interests. So it may agree to say zero tariffs and quotas on goods, but in exchange for maintaining quotas on fishing in UK waters. And all of that is before even services get discussed. And obviously the UK financial services sector is massive, it's important, but services broadly in the UK economy are dominant and a big part of UK exports. It's very unlikely they'll get to any serious discussion of services in the timetable that Johnson set out.
Yeah, it's an awfully busy 2020 and maybe going beyond. Thank you so much, Therese Raphael, reporting from London. And now it's time to get a check on how the market's reacting to today's top stories. Joining us now is Kayleigh Line. So it looks like they're doing all right in the equity market.
Doing all right. I mean, we snapped a 5-day winning streak yesterday, but today it is right back to the up and up with the S&P 500 at yet another record high. Now, granted, this week we've really been seeing some tight trading ranges. We've been looking at a different trading range of about 10 points in the past 3 days. Today we are a little bit more meaningfully higher, and I think you're just seeing a market in which there's no major upside catalyst, so we're not seeing huge moves to the upside, but there's also not a lot of downside surprises coming into the market, so it's just kind of steady as it goes, and that bullish sentiment just doesn't seem to be getting meaningfully dented.
It may be more interesting on the bond side, actually,
right,
because it seems like the world is getting used to the idea that maybe the central banks aren't going to keep cutting, and as a result, we see that yield curve really steepening for the 10-year.
You're seeing it steepen. The 10-year yield, I mean, 2% looks in sight yet again, which is something we haven't seen in quite some time. And the 2s10s, that is now at the widest since fall of 2018. We're looking at about 30 basis points on that spread, which is something we haven't seen in quite a while. And of course, a lot of that just speaks to the risk appetite in this market.
Okay, this is Balance of Power, so we have to ask you the impeachment question, given what happened yesterday. How do markets react to impeachment? How have they reacted in the past?
Seems like they really couldn't care less, to be honest with you. I mean, of course, this is only the third impeachment we've seen in history, but when we look at history as a guide at the Nixon and Clinton impeachment proceedings, under Nixon, those proceedings, the S&P 500 fell about 13%. Under Clinton, it rose 28%. Now, obviously, very different reactions. The difference is that the Nixon proceedings were in the post-Vietnam War recession, and Clinton was at the height of the dot-com bubble. So I think what that tells you is that the economics matter a lot more to the market than politics, and that's probably, frankly, what we're seeing this year.
Yeah, there were bigger forces at play, no doubt.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you so much to Kayleigh Line for that report on the markets. We're going to turn now to Mark Crumpton because he is here with Bloomberg First Word News.
David, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell calls the impeachment of President Trump unfair. Speaking on the Senate floor today, he said the move was a, quote, partisan crusade. He added Democrats had no evidence against the president.
They impeach a president whom they do not even allege has committed an actual crime known to our laws. They've impeached simply because they disagree with a presidential act.
Leader McConnell also accused House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of being afraid to send, quote, their shoddy work product to the Senate. Speaker Pelosi hasn't said when she will send the 2 impeachment articles to the Senate for trial. 7 Democratic presidential contenders will take the debate stage tonight as they try to convince voters they are the party's best hope to deny President Trump a second term. As our Kevin Cirilli told us moments ago, the debate's being held in California, the biggest prize in the primary season. The race in California has largely mirrored national trends, with former Vice President Joe Biden, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, and Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren clustered at the top of the field. They're followed by South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg, Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar, and businessman Andrew Yang and billionaire philanthropist Tom Steyer. In India, the government is barring protests over that new religion-based immigration law. Still, thousands defied the ban today to express their anger. There now have been 8 straight days of unrest. The law bars undocumented Muslims from neighboring Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan from seeking citizenship, but it allows migrants from other religions to do so. Sudan is marking the first anniversary of mass protests that led to the ouster of former president and longtime autocrat Omar al-Bashir. The anniversary drew crowds to the streets across the country. Sudan is under heavy international and regional pressure to reform. The new government wants to get Sudan removed from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism so that it can attract badly needed foreign aid. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, President Trump is now officially impeached. But will that hurt him or help him in an election year? We ask our political panel next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
On this vote, the yeas are 230, the nays are 197, present is 1. Article 1 is adopted.
This lawless partisan impeachment is a political suicide march for the Democrat Party. Have you seen my polls in the last 4 weeks?
That was the split screen last night. For only the third time in U.S. history, the House voted to adopt articles of impeachment against the President of the United States, while President Trump left Washington to field a campaign rally in Michigan, a state essential to his reelection effort. To take us through the political implications of what we've just witnessed, welcome now our political panel of Jeannie Zaino, political science professor at Iona College here in New York, and Brendan Buck. He's former top advisor to Speaker Paul Ryan. He's joining us today from Washington. So, Jeannie, I'm going to put it on you first of all. It was thought that maybe impeaching a president would really hurt the president politically. It's not clear right now that it is hurting him, particularly in some key states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I mean, it's done remarkably little to change his poll numbers. And in fact, in some of the polls, he's ticked up a little bit from where he was a few months ago. That said, you know, it is very difficult to make the argument that impeaching the president is going to help him by any stretch of the imagination. So, you know, is it going to hurt him? We don't know yet, but it's certainly not going to help him, except, and I say this is a big exception, it has done things like brought both the Democrats and the White House to the table on USMCA and some other things that I don't think we would have seen happen if it hadn't been for the impeachment. So they've been able to move forward on some things that otherwise they may not have.
Brendan, could we expect this to cut either way come November? November's a long time from now, right now, in political terms.
Sure, we don't know, what the situation will look like a year from now. But, being impeached is never a good thing. Absolutely, let's be clear about that. But this could not actually have gone any better for him if you look at it politically. Yes, he did get a trade agreement done that I don't think would have happened had this not happened. And this entire thing has played into his entire narrative that I am the victim, that establishment forces in Washington are out to get me, and therefore, by extension, out to get you, the voter. And so this message plays perfectly for him. He gets to play victim. He gets to be the center of attention. And then at the end of the day, he gets to say that I was acquitted in the Senate and I'm victorious at the end of it. So I don't really know what Democrats have gained. I know that the president has gained something. And the reason that Democrats are a little concerned about this is the way that Nancy Pelosi is bringing along this trade agreement at the exact same time. It is not a coincidence that they are doing this the same week as articles of impeachment, because she needs to tell those moderate, vulnerable Democrats, here's something you can go home and talk about other than impeachment.
So Brendan, it doesn't appear to be hurting the president yet, may never hurt the president, but what does it do for the country? What does it do for future presidents? I really wonder, do the Republicans want to be in a position of sending a message to future presidents that it's okay to call up a foreign government and try to get an investigation of your political appointment? Is that something we want to do as a country?
No, I don't disagree with you at all. And I think one of the things that I'm personally concerned about is, impeachment is supposed to be the strongest tool that we have to hold the president accountable. And if this process ends up sort of cheapening that tool and making it look like it's not actually a threat to him, what are the guardrails that are left? And I guess the guardrails that are left are public opinion. And, a president is still going to do what is in their best political interest. The problem here is that, as we've talked about, this hasn't really hurt him with public opinion. And for all this drama, the craziest thing about this is we are basically right back where we started politically. So I don't know, what the future holds for this, but I think the only real guardrail left are the American people.
So I want to ask you, Jeannie, what is the best strategy for the Democrats right now? Tulsi Gabbard, a Democrat, actually abstained. She didn't vote for or against yesterday, saying, I can't condone what happened. It was wrong, so I can't vote against it. At the same time, I don't think it's impeachable. Is there some other course that the Democrats might pursue to register, at least, we don't want our presidents doing things like this, but stop short of what will not happen, which is convicting a victim from office?
Well, Tulsi Gabbard also was asking for a censure, which obviously she could not get and they could not get. And you had several Democrats actually a few days ago calling for a censure for that very reason. And I think we have to be clear. What we saw on the floor yesterday was Democrats, in many cases, making a very difficult decision to put their conscience and their support for the Constitution above their electoral prospects. Because as was just mentioned, this could really end up getting some of them in really hot water in their districts. People like Slotnick, who had to make a really tough decision, and she's facing a lot of heat at home. So they put their conscience over their electoral prospects. And, you know, I think the question here is, will voters reward that in the end? And again, we don't know. Or will they say that, you know what, we're going to throw you out because we don't like what you did?
Brendan, which brings us back to that debate tonight out in Los Angeles. And is it the best strategy, frankly, for the Democratic candidates for president just not to mention it at all? Is it going to be a major factor in the debate, or are the Democrats eager to go on to something else?
It hasn't been a focus of any of the debates thus far, and for one simple reason, that they're all on the same page. You know, a debate is supposed to be an opportunity to differentiate yourself from your opponents. They're all on the same page here. They're all for impeachment, so I don't imagine they're going to spend a lot of time talking about it. But beyond that, another striking thing about this, which talks about the politics of it in general, is that even out on the campaign trail, you don't see the Democrat candidates talking about this. They want to talk about issues that are more tangible to people's lives: healthcare, jobs, drug prices, whatever it may be. And I think that's a sign that they know that this is not really an animating issue for average voters. And if they want to take advantage of the situation that they're on the debate stage, they need to talk about other things.
Well, and the fact that it's not animating, Jeannie, is the fact that the country's split right down the middle. So if the Democrats are going to have a chance come November, they got to get to other things.
They have to get to other things. This has been a hyper-partisan exercise, of course. And what Democrats need to focus on in that debate tonight is things people are talking about. That is health care, that is jobs, that is education, that is guns. Those are the issues that got them elected in 2018. They cannot forget that. And they haven't. I would say all of these candidates on the campaign trail have been very clear. They're focused on what voters care about and will vote on in 10 months, when impeachment may seem like a distant memory.
Okay. Thanks very much to our political panel of Jeannie Zaino here in New York and Brendan Buck down in Washington, D.C. Still ahead here, the new year brings a revolution in global shipping with new rules on fuel. It's not our stock of the hour, it's our commodity of the hour. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. January 1st doesn't just ring in the new year. It also brings a big change to the shipping industry worldwide as new regulations from the International Maritime Organization go into effect, requiring ships to use fuel with less sulfur, raising issues for shippers, for refiners, and maybe even for potential consumers. We welcome now our resident expert in all things oil. She is Alex Steele. She's the anchor of Daybreak Americas and, of course, of Commodities Edge. Welcome, Alex. Good to have you here.
David.
Okay, so January 1's the day. I wake up January 2. How's my life different? How's the world different?
I don't know if that day you're going to see a lot of difference, because the commodity market's going to move ahead of the actual implementation. So we're already seeing the dislocations within the oil market and the product market today. But for the first 6 months, this implementation is quite a big deal. It cost the tankers basically have a couple options. They put millions and millions of dollars into a scrubber. You take nasty fuel, you turn it into nice, pretty fuel, or you have to start buying this lighter quality fuel. And the question is, will there be enough? Is it where you need it to be? Will it be too expensive?
So you talk about dislocations. What do those mean? Is that it's paying more money? Is that waiting longer for stuff? Is there the buildups at ports so people can't get their fuel?
All of those things. So basically, if you're a tanker and I'm going from U.S. to Asia, for example, and I have to have this light sulfur fuel, when I get to Asia, I have to actually then have the light sulfur fuel in Asia to refuel my ship to then go back to the U.S. So there needs to be the right kind of product in the right kind of port in order to do that. You also need tankers that can take on that kind of supply. Also, they need to move really fast to get things places. You might move slower. If you don't have the fuel, you want to burn a little less. You might see short haul tanker ships instead of the longer ones. You might have like 5 days rather than 20 days for shipping, for example. And it's going to take a little bit for the industry to sort itself out.
So as I understand, there's a standard of how much sulfur can be there, but there's not a standard about how you fix it. There are different ways of fixing it, different kinds of fuel, and you said there could be scrubbers and things like that. It's not like unleaded fuel. There's just one unleaded fuel. You have to use it.
Right.
So is that going to exacerbate the situation where are we better off to have, like, here's the fuel, it works?
Well, yes and no, because the problem is if you need the fuel, like, okay, this is the fuel, guys, take it or leave it. You need all the refiners to be able to make that exact fuel. That doesn't happen. So there's some refiners that are really complex that can take lots of different oil and refine it into these products. There are other refiners that can't do that. They need just this oil that you have over here, or other refiners that can do a little bit but not a lot. So you have to have a complete organization of the refiners and the products to make that happen, and that's just not the case.
So who enforces this IMO regulation? I mean, who actually goes to you and says you have to do that, I'm going to charge you?
So the countries. So basically all the countries are responsible for their own area and the port, and you get fined. Like if you're not in compliance, you're going to get fined. Whether or not that fine is going to happen January 2nd or maybe in March or maybe in April remains to be seen. But there's real money behind it, so you actually have to fix it. Also, one of the solutions to fix it is an open loop scrubber, but the issue is you can also put some sludge into the sea and the ocean because of that. So some ports are now banning that tanker. So it leaves a lot of question marks in the shipping industry, a lot of costs, a lot of difficulty getting supply, and that will trickle through to us in some capacity on our product side.
Alex,
if we buy a banana.
Oh, you buy a banana, okay. Always great to have Alex Steele with us talking about bananas. And you can see much more of Alex right after Balance of Power on her program, Commodities Edge. That's going to start at 1 p.m. Eastern Time today. Up next, Senator Mike Braun of Indiana is at the center of 3 big votes on Capitol Hill: an appropriations package, USMCA, and the upcoming impeachment trial of President Trump. He's going to join us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. From New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, now that President Trump has been impeached by the House, the Senate must decide the timing and structure of the trial to be held early next year. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that there's precedent for her decision to delay announcing her list of House impeachment managers.
The next thing for us will be when we see the process that is set forth in the Senate. Then we'll know the number of managers that we may have to go forward and who we would choose.
Responding to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's comments slamming the impeachment, Speaker Pelosi said the nation's founders didn't expect to, quote, have a rogue president and a rogue leader of the Senate at the same time, end quote. One of President Trump's staunchest allies in the House won't seek re-election. North Carolina Republican Congressman Mark Meadows reportedly may even leave Congress before his current term expires. Meadows told Politico his work with Mr. Trump's administration is only beginning. Since the president took office, Meadows has been one of his closest advisors in Congress. Queen Elizabeth formally opened a new session of Britain's Parliament today. She laid out Prime Minister Boris Johnson's plans to use his commanding majority to take the UK out of the European Union and shake up the country's public services. Prime Minister Johnson's Conservative Party won last week's election on a pledge to get Brexit done by leaving the European Union on January 31st. In France, there are small signs of progress in the strike that's crippled the country's transport networks. Negotiations between the government and unions continue as hopes rise the disruptions will be over before Christmas. Protesters have been demonstrating against French President Emmanuel Macron's plans to overhaul the country's pension system for more than 2 weeks. That would include raising the retirement age to 64 and ending special privileges for some workers. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Today, the Senate is voting on appropriations bills to keep the government open, with big increases in defense spending and a range of security and social programs. We welcome now a member of the Budget Committee. He's Republican Senator Mike Braun of Indiana, coming to us today from Capitol Hill. So I understand, Senator, that you just came from a procedural vote, which is a prelude to the vote on the ultimate bills. Give me this answer simply. Are you happy with these appropriations? Because we like our senators to be happy if at all possible.
No, I'm unhappy. I'm on the Budget Committee, and it's probably the most important committee here that has the least amount of relevance, because budgets went out the door about 20 years ago that we actually did, appropriated to, and lived with. So there are so many escape clauses. That's what's fueling these trillion-dollar deficits. A lot of that's mandatory spending. That's a trick here. You change it from discretionary to mandatory. And I'm one of the few that votes if there's not any reform, if you don't see anything actually changing. We're putting a big load on our kids and grandkids. So this is a pleasure for me to vote against this stuff today.
So Senator, if you could take a blue pencil and go through this, where would you cut?
So that's the big deal here. We as Republicans and conservatives, for me, defense is the most important thing we do. Obama did emaciate it back in his stretch. That got pretty well put back to where it needed to be in, I think it was March or April of 2018. And I told my fellow conservatives yesterday at lunch that if we aren't willing to constrain, find efficiencies in defense, how are we going to get them to spend less on domestic spending? So that's one issue. Plus, the other side holds the threat of a budget or a government shutdown, and we need to get a bill across that does not shut down the government, so the appropriators and the spenders can't use that as leverage to make you vote yes on these bills. I'm going to be speaking out about that, and it's a pleasure because I'm backed up big time in a place like Indiana where we operate in the black, have rainy day funds, things work, we make the hard decisions.
So we're talking with Senator Braun of Indiana, as he just said. So Senator, go back to the defense just for a moment, because if you talk to some senior military people and retired senior military people, they often say, look, we could spend this money better. We need to increase certain spending without a doubt, but there are some things, particularly some big complex weapon systems, that really we don't need as much. If we listen to the military, would we be able to effectuate those efficiencies you talk about?
If we listen to any stakeholder in this government, you're going to get some version that we've got to do it. All I'm saying, thank goodness we're the only reserve currency, so we're able to pay for all this largesse by borrowing $1 trillion a year, throwing it on our kids and grandkids. Those chickens will come home to roost when we completely deplete the Medicare trust fund here in 6 years. Or if some other countries start to become places where people want to park their capital. And then we'll be dealing with it by crisis. I'm saying here, it needs to be across the board. Politically, we can't ask them to cut domestic if we're not willing to constrain defense. And we're spending too much everywhere, and you need the political will to talk about it.
Senator, let's turn now to another issue on your agenda today. As I say, you got a busy day up there on the Hill, and that's the USMCA, that successor to NAFTA. Yes. Your colleague, Senator Pat Toomey, has come out. He has an op-ed actually out today. Yep. He has spoken out and said, look, he's not all for this because he thinks this is perhaps the only trade agreement that actually will curtail trade in various respects. It's the rules of origin on the automobiles. It's the labor provisions, a lot of provisions. Does he have a point?
Hey, I've come to respect Pat Toomey. He's one of the smartest guys here. We're both fiscal conservatives. And I've also learned that there's nothing pleasing in any of these bills in its totality. So he is focused on some areas that I have heartburn with as well. But this helps farmers out especially, and that's the most struggling part of our economy. It helps manufacturers out. You create a lot of jobs with it. It's a win-win. The things he is talking about, I don't like either, but this is President Trump's signature package along with what they did back in December of 2017 with taxes and jobs. It needed to get across the finish line. Pelosi was playing footsie with it, only agreed on her end because of the political consequences they're realizing with the impeachment saga. So we just disagree on this point. I agree with him on the particularities, not the totality.
Senator Mike Braun of Indiana we're talking with right now. So, Senator, you mentioned the impeachment situation. I'll ask one question about that, which is, you're a juror, so I'm not going to ask you how you're going to vote, because I don't think that's particularly good. But I think we all can agree we probably don't want to come out of this process, however it ends up, sending a signal to future presidents that we approve of calling up foreign leaders and asking them to interfere in our elections. How do we come out of this so we send the right message to the next president?
Well, all along, I don't think anybody liked that generally, but was it impeachable? I think that's the issue we're seeing now. If you look at the political tea leaves, the American public wants to get this behind us, and they don't think the House has made the case. But that shouldn't in any way say that you condone what you were talking about there. So it's like anything here. I think that it's occupied way too much airspace. It's been calculated before they even had a reason in terms of why they wanted to impeach our president. To me, that tainted its origins. So I look at what I came here for, and it is to get a budget done, to maybe weigh in on infrastructure, to lower the cost of health care. And I know I'm solid there with my constituents, Hoosiers, and I think that reflects what the American public wants in general anyway. So
I always like to ask lawmakers about their constituents, and you took us there, the Hoosiers. What do they really care about in Indiana right now? And whether they're Republicans or Democrats, what do you hear from them that they really want out of Washington, and maybe the reverse, don't want out of Washington?
When I ran, it was clearly the cost of health care, border security, and Hoosiers, because we're fiscally responsible, worried about will Medicare, will Social Security be there for future generations. And we need to get back on point there. The budget is an example of where Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid drive all our deficits. Record revenues, because we're at the sweet spot of generating revenues to where you have a vibrant economy and you don't tank the economy with high taxes. We spend too much. Most of it is in the mandatory spending. It's an unpopular topic, but I didn't come here to avoid unpopular topics. We need to do it for future generations.
Okay, Senator, always a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for your time on what I say is a really busy day. That's Senator Mike Braun, Republican of Indiana. Coming up here, we're going to talk trade with former Senator and former Governor of New Hampshire, Judd Gregg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. Historically, Republicans have been associated with free trade, with Democrats being more protectionist. But a lot of things have changed under President Trump, with his aggressive approach to trade not always easily reconciled with traditional Republican norms. Welcome now Republican Judd Gregg, who served 3 terms in the United States Senate, representing his home state of New Hampshire, after being governor of the state. He comes to us today from Manchester, New Hampshire. So welcome, Mr. Senator. It's great to have you with us. Address the issue of free trade, as it were. Now, we have what we're told is going to be an agreement with U.S. and China, but it has certain quotas about agriculture and stuff. It doesn't feel much like free trade. And we have Pat Toomey of the Senate actually coming out and saying, I've got some real problems with the USMCA, that successor to NAFTA, because it restricts trade in a lot of ways. Where is the Republican Party on this issue now?
Well, I think it's a bigger question is not the party, it's where President Trump's taken the party. As you mentioned in your introduction, conservatives have historically been for free trade, but this president isn't all that conservative in a lot of areas. For example, he's run up the deficit more in 3 years than any president in our history, and he doesn't seem to believe in international alliances, both of which are at the core of a conservative philosophy. And in the area of trade, there is the issue of him picking winners and losers. He literally picks certain segments of our economy and says, well, I'm going to make you a winner. And other segments of our economy he says, well, I really don't like you or you don't like me, so you're going to be a loser. And these trade negotiations have fallen into that category. And in my opinion, not a lot has been accomplished. And what has been accomplished, except for USMCA, which I do support, but with the Chinese, has been marginal compared to the harm it's created relative to the American consumer and American business trying to be engaged in international trade.
But Senator, is this the sheer force of will of President Trump, or was he addressing a broader issue that people, at least a lot of people across the country, were open to curtailing free trade because globalization they see didn't work that well for them?
Yeah, I think he's a populist president, and populism basically has to have an enemy, and the enemy was free trade for a lot of folks. But the rising economy has been driven in large part by trade. And as you curtail trade, you have an economy that usually contracts. Conservatives genuinely believe, or I think conservatives genuinely believe, that the more open the markets are, the better we're going to be because our nation is more entrepreneurial, it's more aggressive, and we're better at it than other nations. The Chinese are a legitimate competitor, and they do clearly manipulate and have manipulated their currency, and they also take advantage of our intellectual property. But so far, most of the agreements which have been discussed, even though they've talked about those two issues, have not reached any agreement on those issues. And this most recent agreement with the Chinese was an agreement to agree, or an agreement to consider to agree. And so until there's actual payoff, I don't think we're going to get very far. And you got to remember, the Chinese government is not a democracy. They don't think in terms of four-year elections. They think in terms of decades, because that's how long they've been there and that's how long they expect to be there. So in negotiating with them, you got a little bigger lift than if you think you're going to negotiate with, say, the Europeans.
We're talking with former New Hampshire Senator Judd Gregg. So, Senator Gregg, we just had Senator Mike Braun, a current senator from Indiana, on. He's a member of the Budget Committee. You chaired that committee. He said some things about the deficit, and particularly things like entitlements, some of the mandatory spending, and the deficit we're running up. Do you agree with his position? What should be done?
Well, I agree 100% with it. We're closing in on a debt-to-GDP ratio which mirrors Greece's situation. Fortunately, we're a much stronger economy, and the people of the world have more confidence in us than they did in Greece. But the simple fact is that if you're running $1 trillion a year deficits, someday it's going to catch up with you. And it's going to catch up with us as a nation somewhere in the mid-period of the next decade, most likely. And there's going to be a crisis. As he mentioned, other nations may become a better place to put capital, and the United States economy will start to contract. Standard of living will go down as we try to pay off the debt. So running up all this debt is really bad for our kids and our grandkids, and it's a huge mistake. In fact, what they're about to pass in the Senate, they passed it in the House, adds another $500 billion of new debt to the deficit. It's outrageous. I mean, they've doubled the discretionary spending debt in the last couple of years, and now they're going to add another $500 billion to that. And that doesn't even consider the entitlement side of the accounts, where the deficits are going up and the debt is going up astronomically. So he's absolutely right. We've got to get our arms around this deficit and debt issue. It can only be done in a bipartisan way. And unfortunately, there's no leadership for bipartisanship in the Congress or in the presidency these days.
Well, and as we go into an election year, I don't hear any of the candidates particularly talk about getting our arms around the deficit. Let's turn to the New Hampshire primary right now. Exactly, just the opposite. Let's spend more money. As we turn to the New Hampshire primary now, is it less important than it was in the past? People seem to be focused on Iowa, I guess because it's first up. But will New Hampshire play as an important role on the Democratic side seeking the nomination?
Yeah, I think the first three events, New Hampshire, Iowa, New Hampshire, and North Carolina, and South Carolina, are going to have a huge impact on Super Tuesday, which comes in March, when you've got a major vote coming out of California and another number of other large states. So yes, I think actually these three states are once again going to have a significant impact. Whoever comes through these three states finishing first, second, and if it's the same person finishing first, second, they're going to be in a unique position. It's going to really sugar off the field, to use the New Hampshire term, which we use to make maple syrup. It's going to sugar off the field, so you're really going to be down to 2, maybe 3 candidates by the time New Hampshire is over, I think.
Sugar off the field. I'm going to remember that. That's terrific. Many thanks now to former New Hampshire Senator and Governor Judd Gregg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Westin. Impeachment is an extraordinary remedy provided for in the U.S. Constitution. And each of the 3 actions to impeach a U.S. president is in some ways without precedent. But history still guides what we do as a nation when there are conflicts under our Constitution. And David O. Stewart has become a student of that history, starting out as a lawyer in Washington, D.C., where he represented a sitting federal judge in an impeachment trial. He moved on to become an author of books on history and the Constitution, including Impeached, the trial of Andrew Johnson and the fight for Lincoln's legacy. Welcome, Mr. Stewart, now back to Bloomberg. So, David, thank you so much for joining us. And let's start out with sort of an historical comparison, compare and contrast. Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, William Jefferson Clinton, and now Donald Trump. What is similar among those situations and what is different?
The most obvious similarity is they're partisan. Alexander Hamilton told us in 1788 that impeachments would be partisan, that they involve a political remedy for an offense to the public, and that the comparative strength of the parties would determine impeachments, and that's the way it's been. With Johnson, he was impeached by Republicans, and then with Nixon, again, it was the Democrats who impeached a Republican president. In Clinton, it was Republicans impeaching a Democratic president, and now it's reversed. So that's a common theme. People seem to be surprised by it, but it's about as surprising as having the sun come up in the east. Another factor that's important is the impeachment happens late in a presidency. This is now entering the fourth year of Mr. Trump's term. It reflects a buildup of frustration with controversial behavior, inappropriate behavior by a president until you hit a breaking point. And enough people in the country and in the Congress say, we really can't tolerate that. And we've seen that. Both Johnson and Trump were late in their first terms, in Johnson's case, his only term. Nixon and Clinton were impeached in their second terms. So I think those are constants. You can also see at least three of the presidents were angry men who made sort of grievance part of their politics. That's Johnson, Nixon, and Trump.
David, I also wonder if there's a parallel between Andrew Johnson and President Trump that is different from President Nixon, different from President Clinton, and that is President Trump is proud of what he did. He doesn't deny it. He said, absolutely, I did it, I'm proud of it. Andrew Johnson presumably was proud of the fact that he wanted to pick his own cabinet the way he wanted to pick his cabinet. Richard Nixon was never proud of it. He denied he did it, but he wasn't proud of it. And William Jefferson Clinton apologized for some of his conduct. Again, not saying he should be impeached for it, but is there a parallel there? Because we now have a president who's saying, yeah, I did it. It was, as he called it, a perfect telephone conversation with President Zelensky of Ukraine.
I think you make a very good point. I've sometimes condensed President Trump's defense is essentially, so what if I did? And I think Johnson had the same attitude. I meant to do this. I did it on purpose, and I'm right. And the Nixon and Clinton cases are not like that. Another comparison between Johnson and Trump is there were questions that they were sensitive to about the legitimacy of their presidencies. Johnson, as an inappropriate successor to Abraham Lincoln, whom had been president when Johnson was vice president, then was assassinated. And we know that Mr. Trump is very angry about people who keep mentioning that he lost the popular vote in 2016 and suggest he's not appropriate and truly the choice of the people. So there are lots of parallels.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I hadn't thought of that, David, but the possibility there might be a little insecurity, even a little defensiveness that may have led to some of the conduct that ultimately triggered the impeachment.
Indeed, I think that's possible.
Okay, it's fascinating. Thank you so much. That's David O. Stewart. I'm pleased to say that we're going to be having much more with him coming up in our second hour on Bloomberg Radio. And we're going to be talking with David Stewart, among other things, about exactly the process going forward, whether Nancy Pelosi can truly hold off on sending the articles of impeachment over to the Senate to have them vote, and does she have much leverage, really, with respect to the process that Mitch McConnell, the majority leader, will pursue on the Senate side. Also in the second hour, we're going to have Graham Allison of Harvard. He's in the Kennedy School there on the U.S.-China trade deal. That's all coming up in Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.